Okay, g'day everyone. How are we? That's good. So a couple of days I gave a presentation about a hero of mine that most people had never heard of. And today I thought I'd continue in that vein and tell you 3 stories about maritime heroes of mine that most people, including people from their own country, have never heard of before. The first story is about a man that I consider one of the most successful wartime sea captains in history. But he's better known outside his own country than he is in his native UK. The second story is about a man who stole the Suez Canal and literally wrote the book on seamanship. And then the last story is a story about a shipwreck that broke every heart in a small English village. So sit back, relax, but not too much, and enjoy Unknown Heroes. So Lord Sir Thomas Cochrane, Royal Navy, was the 10th Earl of Dundonald, was born to Scottish nobility in 1775. He was one of 7 sons to the 9th Earl, and each one of those sons went on to have very distinguished careers in the British military or diplomatic services. But the 9th Earl wanted young Thomas to follow in his footsteps and join the British Army. But young Thomas didn't want anything, apologies to Colonel Tony, but young Thomas didn't want anything to do with that British Army rabble, and he wanted to join the Royal Navy. But the father persisted, and at the age of 15, Thomas was enlisted in the British Army. But after 1 year at military college, the Royal Military College, he did so poorly on his exams that his father finally relented and let him transfer to the Navy, which he did at the age of 17. He was a midshipman, and this was at the very outbreak of the French Revolutionary War, where Louis XVI was deposed. He was beheaded during the Reign of Terror, along with 16,594 people, which went to the guillotine. He was assigned to HMS Hind, which was commanded by his uncle, another Thomas Cochrane, and they had very good success. Over a short period of 6 months, they captured 8 French ships, and they also recaptured 2 English ships that had been captured by the French, so a lot of success. And during that period, young Thomas distinguished himself with his bravery and also his initiative and coolness under battle conditions. He was promoted to lieutenant, and in 1898 he was posted as the 8th lieutenant to HMS Barfleur. Now, Barfleur was a very, very famous ship. It was 98 guns, had been the flagship during the American Revolutionary War, the French Revolutionary Wars, and the Napoleonic Wars. And some of the greatest names in British naval history served aboard the Barfleur. But young Thomas was court-martialed while he was serving on that, on the orders of the first lieutenant, a man by the name of Philip Beaver. When the court-martial was convened and the charges were read and the evidence heard, the court-martial really couldn't believe that he was being charged with this. He was given a slight reprimand for being flippant, but Philip Beaver himself was also reprimanded for being a little bit too precious and authoritarian. And this was one of the very first run-ins that Cochrane had with what he referred to as petty authority. We later referred to it as corporal syndrome, when someone's got a little bit of power and wants to throw it around and use it as much as possible. We've probably all experienced that at some time. In February 1800, he was given his first command. It was a prize ship, a small vessel that had been captured by the British, and Cochrane and a crew of 8 were ordered to sail that back to a friendly English port. Now, during that voyage, the conditions were awful. The weather conditions were terrible. 2 of the crew actually fell from the rigging above and they were injured. And Cochrane himself had to climb up into the rigging and set the sails, bring the sails down so that the ship would be more stable. Now, that amazed the ordinary seamen aboard this vessel, because they thought they'd never seen a British naval officer. They didn't know one could or even would climb up into the rigging. But this was the first example of Cochrane leading by example and showing that he wouldn't order anyone else to do something that he wouldn't first do himself. And that reputation went throughout the fleet. He was promoted as captain of HMS Speedy, which was a very small 14-gun brig. And when he first got there, he wasn't very impressed with the ship at all. Below decks, you only had headroom of 5 feet, so he had to duck everywhere he went below decks. And he complained that he could carry a whole broadside of ammunition in his coat pockets because there was only 7 cannonballs, 4-pound shots of cannon, because the velocity, the caliber of the cannon was so small. But it turned out to be a very lucky ship. And of the 6 people that captained this vessel, starting with Cochrane, every one of them went on to become admirals in the British Navy. So a very lucky ship. They had some adventures aboard the ship. At one stage, a Spanish a frigate approached the Speedy. It was much larger than the Speedy, so Cochrane ran up the Danish flag and also flew the yellow flag indicating there was plague on board, so the Spanish didn't board it. On another occasion, he was being chased by a French frigate, which was once again much bigger. So he placed a lantern on a barrel and floated that off at night time into the distance, where he doused his own lights aboard the ship and went another way. And you might have seen the movie Master and Commander, where the same sort of thing happens in that movie. That was based on a real-life experience of Cochrane. But his biggest victory during this time came on May the 6th, 1801. He came up against the great Spanish ship, the El Gamo. Now this was much bigger ship. It had 32 much bigger guns than the Speedy and a crew of 319 as compared to 14 guns and only 54 crew. But Cochrane raised the American flag, which was a neutral flag, and he closed so close to the Gamo before striking the American flag and raising the red ensign and opening fire, that he was so close that the guns from the El Gamo couldn't be angled low enough to be able to fire upon this much smaller Speedy. Although on one occasion, one cannonball went straight through and took out Cochrane's cap, knocked it off his head. Eventually, they kept on firing upon the El Gamo, and when the Spanish sounded the trumpets to get the crew together to try and board the Speedy, Cochrane would turn away and pull away. The Spaniards would rush back to their guns, Cochrane would close again and start opening fire again. And eventually he caused so much damage doing this and so many casualties amongst the Spanish that he and his men were able to board the El Gamo, and despite odds of 5 against 1, they were able to capture the El Gamo. And this made huge headlines in England, and Cochrane became a hero. In fact, over the 13 months that he was commander of this vessel, they captured, destroyed, damaged or grounded 53 enemy ships, which was basically 1 per week, which is a pretty good effort. And all this was reported in the British newspapers, which made him an even bigger hero. Now, the way he did this, most of these ships were damaged by a new innovative form of warfare that he pioneered. He and his men would row into, with Marines on board, would row into a port, an enemy port. If the conditions were right, they would clamber on board the ships, the enemy ships, overcome the sentries if there was any, lock the crew down below, and if there was an outgoing tide and the winds were right, they would cut the anchor rope and sail out and have captured that ship. If the conditions weren't quite right, they would light gunpowder that was on the ships and try and destroy the ships that way, or pour oil over the ships and set them alight. If there was an ingoing tide, because eventually the enemy became aware of what was happening, so they always tripled the guard when there was an outgoing tide. So Cochrane adjusted his tactics, and when there was an ingoing tide, they would row in and these men would cut the anchor ropes of all these enemy ships and they would be grounded upon the shoreline. So very, very effective. And during one of the people that really admired Cochrane was Lord Louis Mountbatten. And during World War II, he went to Churchill and he said, we could try these tactics. And Mountbatten was in charge of the British Special Forces, and that's when the Royal Marine Commandos were set up, and they sent small raiding parties ashore into enemy territory, causing havoc before withdrawing. But on the 3rd of July 1801, while returning from one of these raids, Cochrane and his men were captured. They were taken to the French flagship, where for 3 days the Admiral was so impressed with the stories of Cochrane, he wanted him to dine with him every night so we could hear all these stories of adventure. After 3 days, the French, for some reason, exchanged. Cochrane was part of a prisoner exchange where he was exchanged for a French captain. When Napoleon found out that this man, who he had called the Sea Wolf, had decimated his fleet, had been exchanged for a mere captain, he was apoplectic. He went crazy and sacked the admiral in charge. But in March 1802, peace was signed, and Cochrane went back to Scotland and went to the University of Edinburgh. But peace didn't last very long at all, and in 1804 he was given command of HMS Pallas, which had 32 guns, and during a short period of time they captured 5 and destroyed 5 enemy ships. Then he was given command of HMS Imperius, which was a bigger ship, had 38 guns, but he continued his coastal raids. But because he had more men now, he could think bigger and do bigger raids. And he attacked the fortress of Mongat, which was a very strategic fortress. This is a photo of it, a very strategic fortress on a crossroads. And he defended that fort, which meant that Napoleon, who was advancing on the British army, was delayed for a month by Cochrane occupying this fort, which gave the British time to be prepared. There was also, the French had a series of signalling stations, like semaphore stations along the coastline, where they would quickly send messages to each other. And Cochrane used to like to raid these and burn them down. But on one occasion he found the French code books. He copied the code, left the code book in place, and left. And so the British had access to the French codes for a considerable period of time and could read their plans. And then he attacked Fort Trinidad, which was in Spain. And this was another strategic fort. He defended that for over 2 months with just a handful of Royal Marines, and he was the last to leave. And as he left, he ignited the gunpowder fuse and blew the fort to smithereens. One of his great adventures was the Battle of Basque Roads. Now, Basque Roads is within the port of Rochefort in the Bay of Biscay. Now, the French fleet were blockaded in there. They had gone in there to seek shelter, and the British fleet had come along, and they were blockading in. The British fleet were out in off the coast. But the British were under the command of Admiral Gambier, who was known to his men as Dismal Jimmy. And let's say he wasn't the most positive person in the world. He was a real downer, glass half empty sort of person. And he refused to attack the French in the port because he thought it was too dangerous. Many officers within his own fleet were very, very frustrated by this. And one evening, Cochrane by this stage was a Member of Parliament, and he was in London. He'd been elected Member of Parliament for his district in Scotland. He was dining at a restaurant in London, and the First Lord of the Admiralty walked past. And the First Lord asked Cochrane, what would you do in this situation? Cochrane grabbed a napkin, a cloth napkin and a fountain pen, and drew up a plan for what he would do if he was in command. And the First Lord immediately gave him command of the raid on the city of Rochefort, the port of Rochefort. Now, his plan was, when the people out in the fleet, the officers out in the fleet who had been blockading the French in, heard that this relatively junior officer was going to take command, they were extremely embarrassed. Officers went to Admiral Gambier and protested that he should have been taking action. He should have been more decisive, and it was an embarrassment to the fleet that this junior officer was taking command. But his plan was to set fire ships alight. So when the tides and the winds were right, he set ships alight and sent them into the harbour amongst the French ships. But he also designed what he called raft bombs, which were huge rafts, wooden rafts, and on those he put 1,500 kegs of gunpowder, and then he put artillery shells over the top of that. And he set them alight and set them in to the French fleet. which devastated the fleet. A lot of ships were destroyed, but some of the ships on the fringes of the fleet were able to cut their anchors and head out into open water, but they were easy prey for the British fleet that were out there. A lot of the ships, though, just cut their anchors and they were forced to run aground. And they hadn't been destroyed, they could be refloated. So Cochrane sent a signal to Gambia saying, now, come in now and destroy the fleet. This is the opportunity, they're defenceless, come in and destroy it. But Gambia vacillated again. He wouldn't go in. He hesitated again. He said it was too dangerous. And he actually ordered Cochrane to withdraw. Now, when the two men got together, Cochrane was furious and they had a blazing row. And at one stage, Cochrane accused Admiral Gambia of extraordinary hesitation, which is just one below cowardice. And you just don't say that to an admiral. Cochrane went back to England. He didn't say anything publicly about the raid. The British Parliament and the British press considered this a great victory, even though the opportunity had been lost to destroy the entire French fleet once and for all. They considered it a victory, and on the recommendation of the Navy, of the Admiralty, Gambia was going to receive a parliamentary letter of congratulations from the Parliament and also a monetary reward for this great victory. But Cochrane, using his position as MP, protested this, and he made it very clear to the Admiralty that he would use that position to block any letter of congratulation, and he would stand up in Parliament and tell the world exactly what had happened. Now, the Admiralty didn't really want this. They didn't need a controversy. And when they told Gambia about this, Gambia immediately said that he wanted to be court-martialed by his peers. As I said, the Admiralty didn't want a public confrontation, so they stacked the court-martial in Gambia's favour, and any officers that were going to testify against Gambia were transferred to other stations around the globe. So Cochrane just said that he was going to leave the Royal, he was no longer going to serve in the Royal Navy in disgust. And then came the Great Stock Exchange fraud of 1814. On February the 21st, rumours started circulating around London that Napoleon had been defeated and that he was dead. And the stock market immediately went through the roof, especially a government security by the name of Omnium. Now, after a few hours, it was discovered that this was a deliberate hoax. Napoleon hadn't been killed, he hadn't been defeated, and the stock market came down again. But in the meantime, Cochrane, his uncle, and his financial advisor had sold their shares in Omnium, and they had made a profit of £1.1 million. Now, that's a lot of money today. But back in 1814, that was a fortune. And fingers started pointing at Cochrane and his uncle. He was put on trial, and despite the fact that there was very little evidence, he denied all knowledge of the hoax. Despite the fact there was any real evidence, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 12 months prison, a £1,000 fine. He was given a dishonourable discharge from the Royal Navy. He had his knighthood stripped from him. He was expelled from Parliament. They removed his family's banner from Westminster Abbey, and he was sentenced to 1 hour public pillory, which is being in the stocks. And you can see from this cartoon at the time, on the left-hand side you've got the great naval hero in all his regalia, and on the right-hand side, the two sides of the man, the crooked politician that's had his knighthood stripped, his sword broken, indicating a dishonourable discharge, and his epaulets ripped from his shoulder, indicating that he had been lost all his rank. Now, the public, he denied everything, and the public believed him. So when the by-election was held back in Scotland to re-elect another member of Parliament, even though he didn't stand for Parliament, he was re-elected by the people, but he wasn't allowed to take his seat in Parliament. Eventually, during the 19th century, there was 3 separate inquiries by 3 different Lord Chancellors. They all found that he had no case to answer, that he would have been found, in any fair trial, he would have been found not guilty, and that the trial was based on political reasons other than anything else. In 1832, he'd received a full pardon from Queen Victoria, and his knighthood was restored, and he was reinstated into the Royal Navy. In 1860, the day before his funeral, his banner was restored in Westminster Abbey. And in 1876, his grandson, who turned out to be a lucky guy himself, received compensation for the dishonour of his family of £3.5 million, which once again was an enormous amount of money at the time. And this is his family banner, and this is the public pillory that I was talking about. So he left England in disgrace, but the Chilean Navy offered him a lifeline. They offered him command of their navy in their war of independence against the Spanish. It was only a very small navy. He took command. He trained all the officers and seamen along the lines of the Royal Navy, and they became very, very successful. They captured several Spanish ships during this time, but their most successful operation, and the one that led to independence, was the capture of the city of Valdivia. It was the most fortified Spanish city in South America, but with using his old tactics of guerrilla tactics of rowing ashore, he took 300 men from 2 ships, and they took over the 7 forts that surrounded the city of Valdivia that protected from the sea or any frontal attacks. And the city fell after that. And this one victory led to the Spanish saying, well, this isn't worth it, and they granted Chile their independence. Then he went over to the Peruvian Navy, and they were having their own war of independence against the Spanish as well. So in 1820, he took command of their navy. Their most powerful warship, which was a 44-gun Spanish ship, the Esmeralda, was in harbour. It refused to go out. The captain refused to take that out of port because he was worried about the reputation of Cochrane and his men. So instead, Cochrane and his men rowed in to Callao Bay. I mean, the ship was under the protection of the massive guns from the fort of Callao Bay. So they rowed in, crept up onto the ship itself, overcame the sentries, cut the anchor rope, and they sailed the ship out of the bay. Now, once again, the Spanish said, okay, well, that's enough, and Peru was granted their independence. Then he went to the Brazilian Navy and helped them with their war of independence against the Portuguese on this time. Now, he took command in 1823, but his reputation by now was so strong in South America that he didn't fight any real battles. He bluffed everything. He went to the commanders of the fortresses at Mariano and Belém de Pará, and he told them that if they didn't surrender, he was going to bring his fleet in and destroy the cities. So the commanders surrendered without firing a shot, and Brazil gained their independence from Portugal. Then he took command of the Greek Navy in their war against the Ottomans. But this didn't last very long because soon after he took command, a coalition of navies, including Great Britain, came along to help the Greeks, and he was no longer needed. So in 1832, he returned to Great Britain. Now, by this time, his father had passed away, and he took on the title of the 10th Earl of Dundonald. The inquiries had cleared him of any wrongdoing during that stock exchange fraud, and Queen Victoria restored his knighthood. He was reinstated into the Royal Navy as an Admiral of the Blue, and over the next few years, he received 8 promotions up until the rank of Admiral of the Red. He died in October 1860, and he was interred in Westminster Abbey. Now, 5 ships of the Chilean Navy have been named in his honour. If you ever go to Chile, you'll see statues of him in Valparaiso and Santiago and other places throughout South America. And each year, on the anniversary of Chilean Navy Day and Chilean independence, there's a big ceremony in Westminster Abbey where the Chilean representatives from the Chilean Navy go and lay a wreath in Westminster Abbey as thanks to their hero. So he's, as I say, he's better known outside of England than he is within England itself. Napoleon called him the Sea Wolf, and was in awe of his deeds. The books and movies and television series Horatio Hornblower by C.S. Forrester are based on the life of Thomas Cochrane. And Jack Aubrey, who's the captain in the Master and Commander movies, is also based on Cochrane. So the next story is about the man who stole the Suez Canal. Not an easy thing to do. So the Suez Canal was opened on the 17th of November 1869. It's a marvel of technology at the time. It's 101 miles between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and it cut off the journey around the Cape of Good Hope, saving thousands of lives and hundreds of hours at sea, and cutting the journey down considerably. And to celebrate the opening, the ruler of Egypt, Ishmael the Magnificent, invited a lot of dignitaries along to the opening, including Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, Princess Eugenie from France, the Prince of Wales, who went on to become King Edward VII, and the Prince of the Netherlands, and many other dignitaries, politicians and diplomats, etc. And the plan, and this is a bit of a scene from that opening ceremony, but the plan was that the French royal yacht, the L'Aigle, was going to be the first ship to sail through, have the honour of being the first ship to sail through the Suez Canal. This was because the French had had a lot to do with the canal. They had come up with the concept of it, they'd planned it, they designed it, they had done a lot of the financing of it, so the honour of going through was going to be given to the French. And that was going to be a great honour. Now that was until George Nares came along in HMS Newport. The British had first opposed the construction of the canal. It wasn't until much later that they came on board and bought half of the shares in the canal so that they had half ownership of it. Nares had joined the Royal Navy at the age of 14. He was a midshipman on the Australian station for some time, and then he served as second mate on HMS Resolute, who went is famous for going searching for the lost Franklin expedition. Now, I'll be doing a talk about that expedition later on in the cruise, and it's a great story, so I hope you come along to that. And while he was there, he gained some Arctic experience. He fought with distinction in the Crimean War, but because of his ability to train people, on Resolute and other places, he had this just instinctive ability to train people and pass on information to people. So he was put in command of the training establishment for cadets at HMS Britannia. Now, while he was there, he wrote the Nares book on seamanship. Now, that book was so good that it was issued to every British naval cadet for over 100 years. It was transcribed it was used by all the Commonwealth navies. It was transcribed into 12 different languages and used in Russia and Germany and other countries, South American countries. It was the Bible of seamanship, so much information in it. And a couple of years ago, Lee and I were cruising around on iBout, and we went to a place called Harlingen in the Netherlands, and we watched the end of the tall ships race, which was magnificent. You've got these 80 tall ships, of all different types coming into the harbour at Harlingen. And the way it works is that youth from all over the world sign on to these ships, and they do a series of races around different locations around the world. And if you ever want to give your grandchildren or great-grandchildren, or in some cases here, great-great-great-grandchildren, a gift, I'd recommend this. We saw videos of kids getting onto these ships with a lot of trepidation. I mean, they were very, very nervous. They didn't look anyone in the eye. There was videos of them climbing into the rigging for the very first time, and that was so slow and careful about doing it. A month later, here they are, racing up into the rigging, furling in the sails, tying ropes, doing everything, singing sea shanties. It was great to see these kids with so much confidence. It was very good. And each of these ships had on board a Nares Guide to Seamanship. And in in the information that each cadet received before they went onto the ship, the recommended reading was the Nares book on seamanship, because it taught so much about being at sea. But he was on HMS Newport, surveying the Gulf of Suez, and one night, the night before the opening of the Suez Canal, when it was stark night, total blackness, he used his extraordinary seamanship ability without any lights and without any sound to navigate through this armada of shipping that were waiting to go through. And until the next day, he was found, when dawn broke, they found that he was first in line and the Agile couldn't get past them. So even though the official records of the Suez Canal say that the Agile was the first one through, the unofficial records and the reality is that HMS Newport was the first ship to go through the Suez Canal. Now the Egyptians and the French and everyone else complained. They complained back to London. There was diplomatic cables going backwards and forwards, and publicly Nares was reprimanded. But privately, he was given a medal and he was promoted. They were very proud of him back at the Admiralty. And then he was asked to take command of the HMS Challenger voyage. Now, this is a half an hour talk in itself. I mean, this was an amazing voyage of discovery, incredible for its time. We knew a lot about the oceans and the coastlines of countries by this stage, but we didn't really know anything about the deepest parts of the ocean. And Nares, using his incredible seamanship ability, his surveying knowledge, and his acronym with scientific knowledge, was put in command of this incredible voyage, where they were going to map the deepest parts of the ocean. They travelled 68,000 nautical miles on a 25-foot ship, which was the Challenger, with 243 men on board, with all their scientific equipment and everything else. And this was, this was the precursor to, that laid the foundations of oceanography and hydrography. Hydrography. Let Patrick tell you about that one. He's the expert there. They did soundings using 181 miles of Italian hemp, and during this voyage they became the first propellered ship to travel through the Antarctic area, and they went actually furthest south than any ship had ever gone before. The Nares Deep in the Puerto Rico Trench here in the Atlantic Ocean, which is the deepest part of the Atlantic, is named in his honour, and the Challenger Deep, which is in the Mariana Trench off the coast of Guam, is the deepest part of any ocean, is named for the Challenger. The Space Shuttle Challenger was also named after this Challenger vessel. I had the honour earlier this year of doing some speaking aboard the Viking Sun with this man, who was Lieutenant Commander Don Walsh, United States Navy, retired. He was the very first, he and a Swiss by the name of Jacques Picard were the very first people to dive down to the bottom of the Challenger Deep. And Don gave me this little metal medallion as a memento, and it's something that I really treasure, as I do our friendship. But on completing this mission, the Admiralty decided to give Nares a more arduous mission, and he was sent to the other end of the world, to the Arctic. He took two ships, the Discovery and the Alert, and he sailed up towards the North Pole, taking their ships further than anyone had gone before. He sailed between the coasts of Greenland and Ellesmere Island, which is in Canada, and that's called the Nares Strait in his honour. He took a sledging party and went further north than anyone had ever done at that stage, setting a new record. And he went back to England and he was knighted and he became Captain Sir George Strong Nares. He eventually retired as a Vice Admiral and died January 15th, 1915 at the age of 83. Now, he should be remembered for this incredible voyage of discovery he did aboard the Challenger, and stamps have been issued in his likeness about that voyage. But because of his earlier adventure, he will always be known as the man who stole the Suez Canal. Okay, on to the third story. And I've got to warn you, I get a little bit emotional with this story. It's, I don't know why. I've only done it once before and I never got through it. And so I was going to get Lee to do it, but she can't get through it either. So I don't know why. As I said, my mum was the last 15 years of her life, she was a radio operator with the Australian Volunteer Coast Guard. So I don't know whether that's got, which is the equivalent of the Royal National Lifeboat Institute in England. So I don't know whether that's got something to do with it. It was just the story itself. But a couple of years ago, Lee and I were in England and we decided to go and have a look at Land's End, as you do. Which is the place that, if you were leaving from Liverpool or Belfast, that was the last, and emigrating to Australia or the US or somewhere, that was the last bit of England that you were ever going to see. And so we decided to go there, and on the way we saw on the map this little place called Mousehole, a little village called Mousehole. And we thought, okay, that sounds interesting, let's go and have a look there. If you ask for directions, you'll never get there because the locals call it Mousehole. They wouldn't say a mouse hole. And there's a great pub there, the Ship Inn, and we went there for lunch. And that's when we first heard this story, and it's fascinated me ever since. But it comes down to a voyage by the MV Union Star, which was built in Denmark in 1981. It was on its maiden voyage. It was just a normal coastal freighter, 70 metres long, 11 metres wide, one engine. There was hundreds of these that plied the waterways around Europe. It had a crew of 5 under the command of Captain Henry Morton, and on its maiden voyage it had gone from Denmark to the Netherlands. It had picked up a cargo of fertiliser and it was on its way to Ireland. Along the way, the captain decided to make an unscheduled and unauthorised stop on the coast of England to pick up his wife and 2 teenage stepdaughters so they could spend Christmas together. Now, so there was a total of 8 souls on board the ship. Now, the idea was that they were going to come down from the Netherlands, around the English Channel, and down around here, which is Land's End. And I'll just show you a bigger map of Land's End. And there's Mousehole here. Reads Mousehole to me. But on the 19th of December, at around about 6 o'clock in the evening, the captain, Morton, made a radio call to the Coast Guard at Falmouth, which is the local Coast Guard station. And he reported that they were having engine troubles. The engine had stopped and they were trying to restart it. They were 8 miles off the coast. He didn't send a mayday, but he contacted the Coast Guard on Channel 16, which is the international distress frequency. Now, while he was talking to the Coast Guard, another vessel, the Nord-Holland, because every vessel must monitor Channel 16, the Nord-Holland overheard the conversation. They're a salvage tug. So at 18:16, they contacted the Union Star and asked the captain whether he required a tug, a tow. And he was going to be under the Lloyd's Open Letter of Salvage. Now, this is the Nord-Holland. The Lloyd's Open Letter of Salvage is a standard type arrangement where instead of paying a set fee for a tow, the compensation amount for that tow would be determined by an independent committee later on in London. And that committee would sit down and they'd assess the value of the ship, the value of the cargo, how many people were on board, the nature of the emergency, how close, what likelihood of how much damage was going to be caused. And so in this case, with a brand new ship, this could have been tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds in costs to the shipping company. The captain didn't really have the authority to say this. Technically he did, but he didn't want to take that responsibility, so he asked his head office what he should do. By the time head office came back and gave permission, it was too late. The tug had gone elsewhere and was helping out with another emergency, so they were on their own. Now, at this stage, the weather wasn't too bad. It was force 5, which is something like we had a couple of days ago. But the barometer was dropping and the forecast was for severe weather later on, not in the near distant future. So the lifeboat crew in Mousehole, the Penlee lifeboat crew, were given a phone call by the Coast Guard and they were put on standby. Now at the time, Mousehole is famous for their Christmas lights. People come from all over to see the Christmas lights, and at the time the lifeboat crew were out putting up Christmas lights when they were summoned, when they were put on standby. Now, as I said, weather conditions were awful, and by the time, within an hour, the weather had turned to force 12, hurricane conditions. There was people that said they'd never seen conditions like this in their lifetime. There was 60-foot waves, so that's 18-metre swells along the coastline. So the decision, at 7:41, Moreton radioed the Coast Guard saying that they discovered water in their fuel tanks. So there was no way they were going to be able to restart the engine at all. So they asked for assistance. They still hadn't issued a mayday. So the Coast Guard called in the Royal Navy. And at 1941, as I said, the helicopter Rescue 80 was launched. This was a Wessex Sea King helicopter under the command of Lieutenant Commander Russell Smith from the United States Navy, who was on exchange with the Royal Navy at the time. That helicopter became famous the following year when Prince Andrew used it during the Falklands War. And it's now on display at the Fleet Air Arm Museum in England. The funny thing is that recently Prince Andrew was denied ever touching this helicopter, or let alone going for a ride in it. But I might be confusing it with another story. So, by the time the helicopter reached there, the ship was only 2.5 kilometres or 2.5 nautical miles from landfall. They tried to winch a man down to it. Now, this was pitch dark by this stage. The searchlight from the helicopter was shining down onto the Union Star. It had all its deck lights on, trying to assist them, but you couldn't see anything beyond that. So you couldn't see the waves that were approaching the ship at all. And as Smith was trying to winch someone down there, he had to yank the helicopter up several times because the ship was coming up on these 60-foot waves and coming up towards the helicopter. And the rotors barely missed the superstructure of the ship on several occasions. So in the end, Smith had to say, we can't do this. It's too dangerous, far too dangerous. And so the lifeboat was told to launch. So 12 volunteers from the lifeboat crew, and in the end, the coxswain, Trevelyan Richards, who was a man of great experience, decided that he selected his 8 most experienced crew. Now, 2 of the men that had volunteered was a man by the Nigel Brockman and his son Neil. But Richard said that he wouldn't take 2 members of the same family that night. Conditions were too bad. Sorry. So the lifeboat was launched at 12 minutes past 8. And the way you launch a lifeboat is they get into this shed up here where the lifeboat's stored. The men get on board, they get ready. And when the launching crew think the conditions are right, the lifeboat shoots down that ramp and goes straight out to sea. But on this occasion, the waves were breaking right up to the entrance to the lifeboat station. So they had to wait for several minutes before they could get a gap in the waves before they could launch it. And as I said, these experienced men, the people who launched the boat, said they'd never seen conditions this bad before. The lifeboat was called the Solomon Brown, and it was only 14 metres long, or 47 feet. It's a wooden vessel. It only did a top speed of 9 knots, or about 17 kilometres an hour. And it got to the Union Star at 20:46 or 8:46. At that stage, the Union Star was only 1 mile off the coast. And as it was getting shallower and shallower, the waves started breaking over the ship as well by this stage. So things were desperate. The Commander Smith in the helicopter reported to everyone that they were only 300 yards from the coast. He later reported that time and time again, this little boat kept on going up to the side of the Union Star. It was being bashed against the side of the ship. The men on board were desperately trying to put ropes around the railing on the ship, so hanging on. But each time they did it, a wave would come along and force them off. And it was only by great seamanship by Travell and Richards that they kept on getting back. At one stage, a wave picked up the Solomon Brown and deposited it right on the deck of the Union Star. And when the ship tipped again, it slid back into the water. Smith reported to them that they were only 10 minutes from the beach. They had to hurry. And the little boat kept on going up again and again and again and getting bashed again. And then eventually, it was so close to the shoreline now, the waves were breaking over everything. Smith reported that he saw people rushing out of the wheelhouse and jumping down off the side of the ship into trying to get to the Solomon Brown. The Neil Brockman aboard Nigel Brockman, sorry, aboard the Solomon Brown got on the radio and he reported to the Falmouth Coast Guard. He said, "We've got 4 off." And he said something about a woman, and there was a little bit of a confusion. And he said, "We've got 4 off, still 2 on board." Now, the Coast Guard knew that there was 8 people. So where were the other 2? We don't know. Because the Coast Guard tried to call the Solomon Brown, but they never received an answer. So the next morning, both ships were found bashed up against the rocks. All 16 people were lost at sea. Over the next few days, only 8 bodies were recovered in total, 4 from the Union Star and 4 from the Solomon Brown. And there was 2 of their heroes were buried at Mousehole on Christmas Eve, and the other 2 were buried on Boxing Day. At the inquest, Lieutenant Commander Smith said it was the greatest act of courage that I've ever seen and am ever likely to see. And this is what Churchill said about lifeboats. I'm not even going to try and read that. But some good things did come out of the disaster. At the inquiry, the laws were changed, so the Coast Guard were no longer passive. They could order a captain to take on a tow or abandon ship, and they could issue a mayday on behalf of any ship. So something did come out of it. Neil Brockman, the man who had volunteered but wasn't accepted because they wouldn't take 2 members of the same family, 10 years later he became the coxswain of the Penlee lifeboat, and he served in that capacity for more than 15 years. So if you ever go to Mousehole, and I recommend that you do because it's absolutely stunning, you'll see memorials about the crew and lots of information about the crew. And on the anniversary, on the 19th of December on each year, which is only a couple of days ago, in honour of the crew, the Christmas lights are turned off between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock. So that's the story of the Penlee lifeboat disaster. That's Unknown Heroes. I hope you've enjoyed it and hope to see you next time. Thank you.